Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Once again, we are in the remote COVID-19 mode. And as long as we're in that mode, we are going to try and focus our show topics to issues that have cropped up due to this crisis. So today we're going to talk a little bit about understanding ESG expectations during the COVID-19 crisis. And joining me is someone who's spent a serious amount of time on this lately. Please welcome back Paul Washington, who's the Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center for the Conference Board, and as importantly, former Senior Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary for the Warner Media Group, which gives him the credibility of being in the boardroom many times. So, Paul, welcome.
Delighted to be here. Yes, I had 689 board and committee meetings at Warner Media / Time Warner. So I've got my battle scars.
That's why we value your opinion. So now you've got this. You're directing the ESG Center, and you've got all these issues, and particularly the issue of ESG, which we want to talk about. You have the Conference Board recently did a report from some survey information, and it was from that GCs and other executive officers felt that the COVID crisis would sort of defer much of the focus on ESG corporate goals, and that investors would sort of, let's say, back off maybe a little bit while everybody was dealing with all this stuff. But I've also heard you talk about that is not necessarily the same feeling that institutional investors have. So could you take a second? We still have this, that creates a gap. Okay. We had a gap before that we were trying to close. It got closer, but now it seems like the gap is a little wider again. So sort of what's the deal here?
No, there definitely is a gap, and it's a gap between investors and companies, and it's also a gap within companies. A substantial portion of general counsels and people in the legal field think that this pandemic is either going to put the sustainability efforts of the company on hold, and goodly number actually think it's going to decrease the emphasis on sustainability. There are others who think that it'll increase the emphasis or that it'll shift the focus, but a good number think it's on hold or will be actually decreased. Meanwhile, you have investors, and it's not just BlackRock, it's investors across the board are saying that actually ESG is going to continue to be important. And in fact, they're looking for a couple things. They're saying that when companies engage with investors, they want to see what you said in the past about what your ESG agenda is, and they want to hear from you as to where it stands now. And did all your good governance procedures actually work? Where are you with your sustainability program and so forth? So I think we're looking at a gap there that will need to be bridged by increased transparency, if not in formal disclosures, and at least in engagement with shareholders. Companies will need to talk to their shareholders with a high degree of transparency about here's where we are with sustainability, and these projects are on hold. These are the ones we're going ahead with, and the reasons why. And in order to have effective engagement, companies are going to need to have a company view on this topic. It can't just be the personal view of the general counsel or corporate secretary, which may be different from the personal view of the sustainability executive. So boards should be asking their management, what's the impact of the pandemic on our ESG, our sustainability efforts, so that you come up with a company view, that company view can then be shared with your shareholders and other stakeholders.
Well, if anybody didn't understand what the S was in ESG, I think that the crisis sort of helped explain that. I mean, because it's all these issues on treating employees, and all the issues of what you do in a crisis that nobody was prepared for. But I have a question for you. Do you think, with your experience with public companies, do you think that the increased focus on ESG actually changed or made people more aware of how they reacted to the coronavirus in the way that they treated employees or suppliers?
I think somewhat. Um, I think that it did have some impact. I think particularly the notion that came out of the Business Roundtable, and it's been around for a while, but that you need to be aware of your stakeholders and not just stockholders. I think there was an extra degree of sensitivity, but it's hard to go through something like this and not have an increased focus on your employees. I mean, along with liquidity and operations, a focus on employees has been one of the top priorities for boards of directors, and I think that's also the natural response. I would just add that there is actually still a gap, frankly. I think companies that have focused on ESG and sustainability generally actually haven't fully deployed the benefits of that in responding to this crisis. They haven't actually. So, for example, if as part of your sustainability efforts, you've involved your focus on human resources and so forth, companies actually, even in their crisis management teams, haven't fully deployed their HR folks and others, and even their sustainability folks in responding to this crisis. So I think it helped a little bit in the sensitivity to the issues, but there's an unused capability there on the sustainability side that hasn't been deployed.
Yeah, I am skeptical whether that has. I think this has been somewhat of a natural reaction,
Mhm.
by companies, in this. At the same time, you know, there'll never be a way of proving that one way or the
Right.
other, So, but
Yeah, I
it,
agree with you. I would just add that I think that companies could have done even more. We've put out a piece on 5 lessons from sustainability programs that can help you in times of crisis. And there are a lot of folks who could have deployed those advantages come with having a strong sustainability program. And actually, if they had focused more on those aspects of sustainability, it would have helped them even more during this crisis.
yeah. Little fun story. I remember during 2008 and 2009, a large company who shall go nameless had made the commitment to not let anybody go, okay,
Hmm.
in very tough times, figuring that it would build tremendous loyalty, particularly with its new hires and younger
Hmm.
workers. And as soon as they got in good times, majority of them left for other opportunities. So
Yeah.
it first of all, there's such a different dynamic to when I was,
Hmm.
worker, where loyalty was so important, and if on your resume you didn't have,
Right.
long-standing time with a company, you were considered a job hopper. To today, where it's totally the opposite. But
That's right.
the S is, to me, the S in all this, the human part, is still to be worked out, and we're still figuring out what contributes to companies. And the bottom line is we're still looking at, in the end, at whatever fits into improving profitability and improving share price. That's I just don't want to lose sight that that's still a very
Yeah.
important endpoint about all this.
That's exactly right. Um, that's if you aren't addressing the needs of your stockholders, it's going to be very hard to address the needs of your other stakeholders. That's for sure.
So let's get into a juicy topic
Yeah.
here relative to the issue of sort of what board members should focus on outside of all these returning to work issues. Okay, because clearly that's major issues that we'll on future shows be talking about. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what other things boards should be focusing on right now. Okay, and it was interesting. I saw BlackRock's 2020 release of their board stewardship principles. Well, actually, it was priorities that they called it, but and they also had with that, what they felt were the key performance indicators. And let me read you that list. There was a group of 5 that they identified as board quality, environmental risk and opportunity, corporate strategy and capital allocation, compensation to promote long-termism, and human capital management. And actually, when I saw this, I thought that it was a pretty good list. The only thing that I would, first of all, I wouldn't have them in that order if that was an order of priority.
Mhm.
I would certainly, for me, put the corporate strategy and capital allocation sort of at the top of the list. But and I was very happy that they had human capital strategy. But the only tweak that I would make is in the environmental risks and opportunity. I would change the word environmental to sustainability risks, because I think it's more complete description of the kinds of risks that I think the board should be looking at. Some of the companies have very little, quote, environmental,
Mhm.
but sustainability to me covers the longer term concept of which includes environmental on what do I need to sustain this business long term. So I'm curious, when you saw this list and knowing that they're looking at this from sort of 30,000 feet, so there's a lot of other things that we could list, but looking at the general things, what was your opinion with BlackRock's priorities?
Well, I agree with you that I would reorder it. I would start with strategy. I would then go to board composition and quality, and on board processes and things like that. Around succession planning and things like that. There's a lot of things to focus on there. And then I think cap then you get to, I agree, sustainability is broader than environmental issues. And I think the things that companies ought to be focusing on, particularly now, that includes human capital management, which includes a much greater emphasis on employee health and safety. And it's not just employee physical safety and well-being, it's employees' mental well-being. I think that's going to be absolutely critical right now. Also, under the heading of sustainability, I would add in supply chain reliability. That's just an absolutely key issue to be addressing. I think there's going to be a general emphasis on environmental issues going forward, but I think some specific areas like employee health and safety, sustainability fall under sustainable supply chains fall under the S issues that they need to be focusing on. Um, I think actually when it comes to compensation to promote long-termism, what we're hearing from investors is right now is not necessarily the time to be making a lot of changes to your executive compensation program. In fact, if companies are spending too much time on that, it may send a bad signal to the market, frankly, that the board is focused on helping the C-suite and not thinking about operations, not thinking about the broader employee population. So I would say that when it comes to compensation, what companies will probably want to do is to think about executive compensation when it's time to do so, when they have a better sense of the impact of the pandemic. And frankly, they need to think about compensation not only in terms of alignment with stockholders, but also, frankly, in terms of fairness with the rest of the employee population. And I guess finally, a couple of things I would add to this list that don't show up, that frankly, thus far have not been the focus of boards. One is a focus on customers. How is the board, how is the company making their customers, especially if you're a B2C business, comfortable coming back to the workplace? A risk that's not covered here is cyber risk. Companies are going to be collecting a lot of medical data. So, what are they doing about data security and data privacy? Those are also really important. And finally, a topic that has not been a big focus thus far, but I think it may inherit in some of these, which is really the company's role as a citizen. How does this affect the company's position on public policy issues that relate to things like economic security and economic equality. How does this relate to the company's role in its communities? And that's on a global basis. So I actually think that there are some other areas that boards will want to focus on that don't show up on the BlackRock list yet, or at least not in the headline of the risk. So unfortunately, I think boards face an even more daunting set of topics to cover, even than those outlined by BlackRock.
Well, no question that the job of a board member has been um, much more complex than it's ever been, and this crisis has only added fuel to the fire. So, Paul, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. Your team there at the conference board has done a great job as a resource during the crisis, and even on a lot of management and board issues outside of the crisis. So keep up the good work.
Thank
And
you.
it's a pleasure to have you.
It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, TK, and thanks for having me.
Yep. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.